So let's talk about some of the units that people feel might be bringing too much value to their army for the points cost. What are some of the most complained about units in Warhammer 40k right now, and do they live up to their hype? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd do a roundup of a few units that there seems to be a commonly held perception are too strong for their points cost. For all the things you can criticise of Games Workshop in 10th edition, I feel like compared with most of 40k's past, internal unit balance hasn't really been too bad with individual factions and armies. After most armies have gone through a bunch of balance passes, the vast majority of units in 40k tend to fall into the somewhat usable category, neither being crazy overpowered or utterly worthless, at least outside of a few units that Games Workshop seem to be deliberately neglecting, things like fortifications and aircraft a lot of the time. At the top end of the power spectrum, units that maybe seem a little bit auto-include and unusually strong often tend to get hit with smaller or greater points increases, to the point where it's maybe more often units and certain detachments getting specific rules given to them that maybe tend to be more of a balance problem than individual datasheets outright. For this one though, I thought it could be interesting to examine a few of the units that people have outsized value for the points, with a roundup of some of the more commonly complained about units in Warhammer 40k. With this in mind, I asked for a bunch of anecdotal feedback from 40k players out there, more of the general channel audience, most of whom, like 40k in general, don't tend to regularly play tournaments all the time, and I basically asked you which units you feel are too strong for the points, and perhaps sticking their heads above the parapet for a nerf in the future. This one's definitely going to be different to a sort of strongest units in game for the points cost sort of video, just due to all the biases that people might have with that. Generally big, scary, intimidating units tend to get focused, things that might be at the forefront of an army giving and receiving damage and defense, and they're far more likely to be talked about than maybe cheap support units that are auto-includes, maybe seen as more of a problem for the big damage and defense gameplay of 40k. In particular, I usually feel that things that are tough to kill maybe get even more focused than just good units in general. There's perhaps nothing scarier than a great big meaty unit that your army can neither really damage easily without a lot of effort. I will also go around deleting your stuff turn on turn, even if it does cost a lot of points to do so. This will also likely skew towards the more popular armies out there, given that people have more experience facing them. And I'd also say there's an element of a scary unit in a strong army is maybe more of a problem than a scary unit in a weaker army. So kind of worth bearing in mind how strong or weak the overall faction is. It might be more of a case that a slightly overpowered or strong datasheet within an overall tame faction isn't really the biggest problem in the world. In any case though, let's talk through each of them, roughly how strong they are in a competitive style game, and what likelihood Games Workshop might have of handing them out a points increase. In any case, jumping into it, there were a few things that got a few mentions, though didn't really quite break into the units that were voted the most. Interestingly, the Dark Angels really seem to have made an impression. Azrael and the Deathwing Knights had a lot of people saying those as units that were too cheap for the cost. I feel like you could definitely make the argument for Azrael. He's utterly auto-include for the Dark Angels, farming command points and giving you some really good buffs for his squad, and has a good melee profile in himself. Even despite a points increase from the very cheap cost that he was before, I'm sure he'd still be good if he went up a touch more, though that would be a direct nerf to Dark Angel army strength. The Deathwing Knights to me are certainly strong, but don't really feel like a massively undercosted unit to me. They are incredibly tanky and difficult to kill, and can handle most normal sized threats in melee, but you do pay a big price tag for them at a big 250 points per unit, which is no small thing. And despite Deathwing Knights and Azrael, Dark Angels are only really getting to sort of mid-ish power levels at the moment. They're definitely not an overpowered army in 40k. Feels like if you did any points increases for Azrael, for example, it should be balanced out by other characters going down. The Dark Angels have a big cast of special characters that are a bit overcosted, really. Otherwise, for mentions, a fair few people said Marnius Calgar. He is turning up in the vast majority of competitive Space Marine lists, though he is paying more points than what he used to, 210, and the company heroes he often leads went up as well. I kind of feel at 210 points he is getting to the point where he's got great abilities, but you are paying a big sum for him. Definitely still a staple in competitive lists though. Interestingly enough, there seem to be lots of mentions of the Great Unclean one too. He did get a fair bit chunkier and scarier with the latest Demons update, effectively toughness 13 and a fair bit more melee power than they used to have. It still doesn't look like he's auto-included for Demon armies, though definitely can be a handful to deal with, putting some rather hefty bulk on the mid-board objectives. Into the more mainline mentions though, and one that certainly came up a whole load were Armigers and War Dogs for the Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights respectively. And to me they do feel like a fairly easy target to talk about for this sort of thing, just because both Imperial Knights and Chaos Knight lists can go absolutely massive on the little Knight spam, and that's pretty much the most competitive way to play them. That's certainly been the case for Chaos Knights for a long time, though it's maybe a little bit disappointing that the Games Workshop seem to be going that way with the Imperials too. There's lots of different datasheets for these, but they're 12 wound toughness 10 vehicles with a 5+ invulnerable save that they can rotate for a 4+ at range, and they move very fast, have good OC, and a variety of scary heavy weapons that tend to hit adequately hard for their cost. Imperial Knight Armiger Warglaives are pretty deadly on the tabletop given the inbuilt rerolls from Lay Low the Tyrants. Helverin's a good supporting fire with the Squire's Duty stratagem. And for Chaos Knights, it's generally War Dog Carnivores and Brigands as the order of the day, the War Dog Carnivore maybe being a particularly notable one at that points cost. Just for pure damage dealing melee strats, it's one of the very best units for its points cost in Warhammer 40k if you compare it against a whole bunch of different factions. For the Chaos Knights, it's been the constant thing that Games Workshop's been criticised for having their strongest army being War Dog spam since their faction really got its big launch. It feels to me like the Carnivore would still be a very good data sheet even if it was a good 5 or 10 points higher. Though to be honest, it feels more like it's just the big knights that actually need to be worth their points cost, whether that's a lower points cost or bigger abilities, either one would help out. Fingers crossed the Chaos Knight book could actually help with it. For the Imperial Knights, Warglaves and Helverins, they were just kind of perplexing really. They were already a good unit that was used in multiples in just about every competitive list, and then for some reason both variants got points drops to the point from where they went from being a good supporting unit to a kind of dominant unit in the list, and that's driven Imperial Knights win rates up to something like 54% or so recently. One of the strongest factions in the game in just purely winning games against each other. They're tending to be a bit more oppressive in a sort of casual meta as opposed to hyper competitive at the tops of grand tournaments, at least with the current rules pre-night codexes and things. I don't think there'd really be any major reason not to put the Armigers back up to their previous points costs. As for likelihood, I'm not sure whether or not Games Workshop would make any changes prior to the night codexes coming out. They're not so very far away. Fingers crossed they manage to do enough to actually divert the focus to the big Titanic Knights once again. I feel like having the option to play Armiger spam or War Dog spam isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think that most people would agree that it would be better to have it as a sort of alternative quirky build as opposed to being the main thing that they do at the competitive level. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Magnet Baron, suppliers of magnets and components for 40k kits and plenty more, based in the USA. I certainly enjoy making good use of magnets myself in my own miniatures on the tabletop. I do just like the way that you can swap out certain war gear and loadouts from a whole bunch of different kits if you put in a little bit of extra hobby effort. So say for my Lehman Russes or Imperial Knights, they can all cycle out the guns and weapons to change things up and try out new variants on the tabletop, or play other things when Games Workshop inevitably changes the rules in weird ways. For the Magnet Baron's offerings, they've just got an enormous supply of high quality magnets for use in hobby projects, and then have a whole bunch of dedicated kits towards Warhammer 40k things. Say for example their Questoris Knight kit here, which has got a bunch of 3D printed components so you don't have to drill anything, and a nice step-by-step instruction guide as to how to get it together. I've got lots of kits, more technical or more simple, for a bunch of other models out there, good magnet supplies in general, and also have some other things to solve some common 40k problems like their flight stands. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, for some of the more complained about units in Warhammer 40k right now, we have the Eldari Fire Dragons. These guys were 100 points when the Eldari Codex dropped, and then Games Workshop nerfed them a bit, going up to 110, though it still doesn't seem to have stopped them from running, say, 3 units of 5 of them in a whole bunch of Craft World lists, being basically the favoured source of anti-tank at the moment. Absolutely stand out in Inari, they're pretty strong elsewhere. For what you get for the points cost, they are a very fragile unit, not too hard to take down if you can either overwatch them or hit them first, but that might not be the easiest thing to do, as they can move blisteringly fast and have tricks like turning off overwatch from battle focus. If vehicles aren't well screened or are playing aggressively, there's a good chance they'll just be able to walk up to very close range or very quickly, blast it with fusion guns, where despite the slight increase on points cost, they have one of the best damage outputs of anti-tank things in all of Warhammer 40k. Basically like Space Marine Eradicators with more shots and more danger, with the full rerolls to hit, wound and damage, and automatic 6 from their Auspex shrine, never mind any other detachment specific things they might pick up as well. If they can get anywhere near a relevant target, they've got a very easy chance to trade up in a long way, with a pretty reasonable chance to one-shot things like Land Raiders. In the right situation as well, they might be able to do transport shenanigans, perhaps jumping back into Wave Serpents if they can stay close enough to one. In particular, they're just crazy standout in Inari though, where you can set up big moves for them. Maybe using lethal intent to just move them around at the end of the enemy shooting phase, so they've got a very easy strike on a tank in the next turn, without the opponent having too much that they can do about it. Maybe not too surprising for those reasons that they make a big impact on enemy tanks and vehicles, and if they get the chance to activate, can absolutely nuke them with near guaranteed reliability. Though in general after that there's a good chance you should be able to pick up the unit without too much difficulty given their defensive profiles. They do feel like quite a point sensitive unit to me. I feel like if you keep on jacking up the points, then very quickly they're going to be not really worth it, which will also be a bit of a shame. But at the same time they're one of the strongest units in one of the strongest detachments for the Eldari at the moment. It certainly seems easy to argue that Inari are one of the strongest armies in 40k right now, with those massive out-of-phase shenanigans and win rates of 60% or more. I sort of guess for things that might get nerfed, Inari are probably more in the fire line than the fire dragons, or at least they probably should be, particularly their lethal intent detachment rule. I really wouldn't be too surprised if Games Workshop hit these with further points increases though. I guess we'll wait and see on that front. At least for the moment they do seem to be outclassing the other variants of Eldari anti-tank, and I could see Games Workshop charging more for that, though it could be very painful if they do some sort of double nerf again with the Inari and these going less powerful at the same time. Next up for units widely perceived as too strong for the cost, we've got some Death Guard with the Deathshroud Terminators and Typhus, 110 points for 3 Deathshroud and 80 points for Typhus. These guys have both been weirdly cheap and nasty for really quite a long time. Kind of enormous damage and defense for the cost, though at the cost of having very little movement at all. They only move 4 inches on the board and Typhus 5. They could deep strike and maybe rapid ingress to get charges on their ideal targets, so they should be able to get onto the front line somewhere. For the Deathshroud, they just have pretty enormous damage and defense versus their vast amount of the equivalents in 40k. 3 wounds each at toughness 6 with Terminator stat lines, and then also a -1 to wound when they're being led by a character is just pretty enormous, and their damage is no slouch either with those big man reapers hitting on a 2+, nice middling strength profiles, the bonuses from contagions and lethal hits to help them punch up against the toughest stuff. Typhus is kind of equally stand out as well, a big damage 3 in melee with his man reaper, -1 to hit in melee, and then perhaps the single thing that takes him from being good to great is his mortal wound attack, being able to blast enemy with mortal wounds with fairly good reliability. Just being able to activate that a couple of times could be enough to deal enough damage to justify his points cost in some games. For their current use in competitive lists, they do seem to be in borderline auto-include territory for the Death Guard, though not every single army uses them. Typhus in particular is kind of hard to go too far wrong with, whether he's with Deathshroud, leading Poxwalkers for a weirdly hard-hitting Horde unit, or even just going alone to do secondaries and being a problematic unit to try and take out with some damage. Really feels like you just can't go wrong with him. For Deathshroud Terminators, there certainly have been some lists that have spammed 3 sets of 6 of them, but maybe it's more common to see 1 or 2 units in an army, and then a bunch of demon engines to back them up. Death Guard in general are feeling fairly well balanced overall at the moment, kind of middling win rates and a bit of top event performance but not loads, so probably don't need a nerf as a faction's concerned, so hitting some of their best units and nerfing these would probably mean they need points cuts elsewhere. I can see why they'd be intimidating to fight on the tabletop though. You can put an awful lot of Deathshroud on the tabletop if you really want to, and that could be all rather repressive in casual games. If you're not doing clever objective things or using mobility and being clever with threat ranges to try and mitigate their impact, then you're probably going to be in for a bad time. There's a pretty reasonable chance they're going to come up on top if they're skirmishing with your faction's elites and try and meet them toe for toe on midfield objectives. Overall, in the context of current Death Guard, they don't really appear to be an obvious problem unit in my opinion, despite a very efficient points cost for their stats. They certainly feel cheap for what they do. Doesn't look like there'll be any chance for balance updates or things before the Death Guard Codex comes out though, so I guess we'll see what happens to them. Fingers crossed they'll still remain a strong part of the army. Remember that Death Guard leak was rumouring something about 6-inch deep strikes, which will be interesting to see whether or not that happens. That could be kind of crazy if so. Moving on, and it feels like the next units are in a similar sort of vein with the Necron Catan Shards, costing somewhere between 265 points or 305. A stellar unit that seems to strike absolute fear into people across the tabletop, even though it does look like their use in competitive lists is kind of limited and in proportion right now. For what they bring to the table, they've got their massive durability, 12 wounds at toughness 11 with a 4+ invulnerable, a 5+ feel no pain, halving damage, and then reanimating wounds, potentially quite a lot of wounds if they happen to be coordinating with a Canoptet reanimator. Between all that, it usually means that you just need to have ridiculous, enormous amounts of damage all focused on them if you actually want to take them down, and there's a pretty reasonable chance of swinging and missing if they make a bunch of good invulnerable saves, and then rapidly starts to undo all your hard work by reanimating, and you can't really afford to half kill one, otherwise you'll just have wasted a whole bunch of your damage. On top of that, they've got scary damage output. The Nightbringer and Void Dragon in particular are going to take massive chunks out of anything that they get into melee with, and the Transcendent one swaps that out for teleports. Still solid enough damage against infantry, but maybe not punching up quite so hard against tough stuff. Basically maybe kind of similar to the previous Deathshroud though. They've just got incredibly good damage and defense style stats, but not really very much movement at all, only moving 6 inches across the board and having a monster keyword which means they have to move around terrain. While there might have been enormous amounts of Catan spam shortly after the Necron Codex dropped in 10th edition, in general the use of Catan in the strongest Necron lists around tend to be kind of limited right now. Just for curiosity, out of this video I took a look at 10 of the more recent successful tournament lists for Necrons, just to see which ones used Catan shards and which ones didn't. Only 3 of them had a Catan of some sort, often the Nightbringer, so while they are used, they're far from an auto-include in Necron list right now. I feel like with a whole slightly slow moving and big damage and defense type thing, they're kind of an interesting one for Warhammer 40k balance in general. Turning up to a casual game with a whole bunch of Catan shards is probably going to be just thoroughly oppressive, and if your opponent's not got a strong and thought through list, they might really struggle to handle them, either doing a clever objective and screening type thing or having the sheer amount of firepower to maybe down one or two of them. Again, like the Deathshroud, it's probably not going to wind up too well if you just march up your faction's elites against them and try and take them on one for one, as their damage and defense stats are really great. It does seem that Necron players on the competitive scene just don't really feel that they quite do enough for their points cost for a lot of armies though. I guess just due to all the competition that they've got going. If you're taking big centerpiece units, you might be tempted by the Silent King, who's a whole chunk of points in his cost, and he's very tempting in Star Shatter Arsenal. Doomsday Arcs might rival them for scary efficient damage dealers. In an Awakened Dynasty, Necrons are likely going to be building around a whole bunch of character combos and leader units, more so than individual Catan that don't have a ton of detachment synergies. Overall, between all that, I'd be kind of surprised if Games Workshop raised the points cost higher on them. But they do feel like an interesting one for 40k balance, both a model that can be horrendously oppressive if you spam them in a more casual environment, but only really seen as kind of okay, and certainly not auto-include for more competitive lists. Next up, in a third entry, in the units that are just big, tough, and very efficient damage and defensive units, we have the Astra Militar and Rogal Dorn tanks, in particular the Tank Commander one, which tends to get played far more, but the regular variant is certainly no slouch either. For around about 250 points or so. That gets you 18 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save, and access to the smoke stratagem, so really quite hard to take down. And some lists like to include a Tech Priest engine tier along with that as well for some 4+ invulnerable saves and healing. Then mounted on that sturdy chassis that's a bit tougher than a Land Raider, we've got a huge battery of guns, usually an Oppressor Cannon and Pulverizer Cannon for two big main weapons, multi-melter sponsons, maybe some melter guns up close, an auto cannon and a heavy stubber. Firing them does take a lot of time, and they've just got a strong battery of guns that's going to be a threat against basically anything in the game, enough shots to matter against lighter units, and enough punch to take down heavy stuff. The Commander datasheet tends to be far more popular, as it can self-order for +1 to hit or faster movement, throw another order out somewhere else, and has some rather nice inbuilt rerolls as well to make it yet more threatening. The regular tank is still seen in competitive lists though, cancelling a save and being a bit cheaper. As a result, when I did a roundup of competitive guard army lists recently, literally every single one of them used a Rogal Dorn tank commander, just seeming to be so good to be completely ubiquitous in Combined Regiment and Hammer of the Emperor, which tend to be the strongest attachments right now. They enjoy the lethal hits and maybe Fields of Fire for Combined Regiment, and as big scary squadron keyword units, they're some of the best things to use on Hammer of the Emperor, including some nice enhancements for them. They can get good value from Lehman Russ Exterminators and Hellhounds, helping out with their AP too. Guarding themselves though, despite the tanks, are doing kind of middling in Warhammer 40k right now for most people. Win rates are around about 47% or so. They're still managing to punch through and take some top placings at events. In terms of how strong they are for the cost, I feel like people generally agree that they are a pretty terrifying datasheet. A really big weight of stats, being hard to take out without some serious effort, and then reliably damaging anything that can get their guns into, and can be fairly fast when not move blocked or screened if they want to. The sheer prevalence of the tank commanders does kind of imply that they're not really very well balanced against other guard options for unit efficiency, and just because of how sheer standout they tend to be, I wouldn't be too surprised if Games Workshop put up the points cost at some stage down the line. I feel like if they did though, it should probably come with points decreases elsewhere for the guard, given that they don't seem to be one of the absolute standout strong factions of Warhammer 40k right now. And certainly as a slight side note, I think it would be best if there was a bigger gap in points between the Dorn tank commander and the regular Lehman Russ tank commander. As for the extra 30 points or so, there's just no real comparison between the two datasheets. The Dorn commander's just so much better. Finally though, and voted in top for units that people think are a bit too good for their points, we have the Primarch himself in Roboute Guilliman of the Ultramarines. After the big Space Marine update that they did around Christmas time, they basically shifted Roboute Guilliman from being fairly playable to utterly auto-include. They allowed him to use 2 of his bonuses, so both have the double Oath of Moment and the discounted stratagems, at the same time as Oath of Moment got the +1 to wound benefit for Codex chapters, so that just meant that doubling down on that would be crazily more valuable than it was before. That means lists with him in can absolutely ruin big tough enemy targets out in the open. Here's a kind of game warping datasheet, where Space Marines potentially have a whole load more value against enemy tough targets if they can destroy the first one and then move on to the second. The free stratagems are pretty great for a number of detachments as well, maybe particularly good for Ironstorm Spearhead, getting them discounted on big scary tanks and vehicles. Then of course he still has some scary Primarch level melee stats that is fairly tough to take down, and when you do he gets up to have another go on a 3+, and particularly when buffed with Oath of Moment he's going to absolutely ruin most things that he charges into. At the moment he's basically in almost every strong Space Marine tournament list. It's probably the biggest cause of bad balance between the Ultramarines and the rest of the chapters out there. Just having Guilliman being this strong for his points cost means that the others don't really get much of a look in. Even with him though, the Space Marine's only around about a 47% win rate, so kind of well balanced overall, but probably hiding the fact that Ultramarines are better than that and every single other chapter are worse. I feel like for Space Marine balance, it was maybe a bit of a fail on Games Workshop's part at the last balance update. Ultramarines quite clearly seem to be the best thing that Space Marines could put on the table, though the only nerfs that they had fell on Calgar and a Uriel Ventress combo with Centurions, but then hit a bunch of other Space Marine datasheets that were maybe worse than the Ultramarines, but also very good for other chapters, and it kind of meant that the gulf between Ultramarines and other chapters didn't get any smaller, or might have even gotten bigger, and just put more incentive to take Guilliman to compensate for the now more expensive Space Marine damage dealer datasheets. It does seem like it would probably be sensible for Guilliman to go up in points by a fair bit, enough to make him a borderline include where you could take him or could not, and then likely to compensate, drop the points cost in a whole bunch of other Space Marine datasheets, or make them stronger in game somehow, to overall make chapters without the Primarch a lot stronger in game, as opposed to ones that need to run Guilliman for his double oath bonuses. Feels like there's a good chance that Games Workshop will do something with them, though it seems like there could be a more major shake-up coming for Space Marine units in the not too distant future, with a whole bunch of chapter-specific content teased on the horizon. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. What do you make of these units, and which of them could do with balance adjustments, if anything? Let me know down in the comments, and are there any other units in the game that you think would be more deserving of nerfs or higher points costs or something, compared with the ones that were most mentioned? I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments as per always. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to the Magnet Baron for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out their things down in the video description. For a few more examples of what they have their magnetizing starter bundle, a bunch of drill bits, a pin vise, magnet applicators, and a supply to get you going. Could be a good all-in-one place to start that side of the hobby if you'd like to. As mentioned, they have a bunch of kits aimed at various different Warhammer 40k offerings, which could be an easy way to make sure that you've got magnets of the right sort of size and power to magnetize different components. Their Questoris Night one is particularly nice with a bunch of their 3D printed bits and full instructions. They've got some dedicated ones for magnetic storage as well, some flush fit magnets that are the exact right height for Citadel bases that can make storage a bit nicer without leaving gaps between the model and the surface it's stored on. And as mentioned, they do have a bunch of flight stands as well, another one of the most commonly magnetized things in 40k to stop those little plastic rods snapping off or becoming too loose. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. They'll be linked down in the video description. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support or keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.